Hello everyone, in this video we're going to be talking about the structure of skeletal muscle. Now, skeletal muscle is actually the most abundant type of muscle we have in our body. We have three main types: skeletal, smooth that you can find in things like blood vessels, and cardiac, which is what makes up the heart muscle. Now, skeletal is quite unique in that it's the only one of those three where we have an element of voluntary control over it. So when the muscle contracts and relaxes, we have a degree of control in that. The other two are what we call involuntary. So if you take the heart muscle, for example, the cardiac muscle, we can't control when that contracts and relaxes, but skeletal we can. Often, just as a side point as well, around joints, we have skeletal muscle that works as sort of antagonistic pairs, if you like. That's the proper term. Antagonistic pairs are pairs of muscles where one will contract, let's say, and the other will do the opposing action. So one will relax to work together to perform a function. A good example is the bicep and tricep in the arm. As the bicep contracts, the tricep relaxes. That's just a little intro about skeletal muscle. Let's get into the structure, because this video is going to be almost like a two-parter. In this video we'll talk about structure, and in a second video on muscle I'll look at the sliding filament theory of muscle contraction. So how this structure aids muscle contraction. So on the left we have a diagrammatic anatomical version of upper arm, or arm around the elbow, and then our forearm. So I'm just going to take this portion here. I'm going to zoom in, and that's what this picture is here. I'm zooming in, if you like, on that muscle. So what we have here, if I just label it, this is our skeletal muscle. And in fact, just for completeness sake, that white bit that you can see at the end, that's what we call a tendon. Tendons are sort of sheaths that connect muscle to bone. So that little white part that you see at the end of the muscle is a tendon. So around the outside, you can see there's a label right at the top to the right of wherever it's a muscle. There's a label going around outside, and that is what we call the epimysium. Just label that in. That's the epimysium. Now, the epi means outside. Epimysium is a sort of sheath or layer of connective tissue surrounding our muscle. Then if you look deeper within that muscle, you can see what appear to be like bundles of fibres surrounded by, and I'll colour one in red just to show you, surrounded by this kind of like, looks like a little membrane, if you like, there, or some kind of outer covering. Those bundles are what we know as muscle fascicles. So we have muscle fascicles surrounded, so groups of these muscle fascicles surrounded by this sort of red outer layer, if you like. Now that outer layer is called the perimysium, and we'll come back to that in the second diagram just below the one I'm labelling at the moment. So what we're going to do now is zoom in, if you like, into that muscle. We're going to look deeper at one of those muscle fascicles. And what you find is when you look into the muscle fascicles, so we can label this here. This is our muscle fascicle. So just zooming in on one, if you like. What we have around the outside, as I said, was our perimysium. So we can put that in here. So we've got a perimysium around the outside of this muscle fascicle. And you can see it's sort of coloured in white on this diagram. We have what's called an endomysium. So we can put that in place. The endomysium is, again, a layer of connective tissue, but it has nerves and blood vessels associated with it. Then there's one label left on this second diagram. So we can see within that muscle fascicle, that bundle if you like, what we've got here is a label. If I'll just colour it in again on red, one of these things here. So each of these that I'm circling, we're now going to identify individually. And that's what this last label is. Each of those are muscle fibres. So individual muscle fibres. Now those muscle fibres have a proper name and they're called myofibrils. It's a really key term there. So we have myofibrils or muscle fibres within that muscle fascicle, surrounded or enveloped, if you like, by an endomysium with an outer perimysium around that. So now let's go deeper. So we're looking at this third diagram down, and what we've done is we've almost zoomed in, if you like, on one of these myofibrils. So imagine this muscle fascicle was like a group of straws. We're now pulling out one of those individual straws, like the diagram suggests here, and we're going to really zoom in and look at that myofibril and see what it looks like. So on this bottom diagram, this is what we call a myofibril. This is one muscle fibre. And we've got, you might be able to see littered around the outside, these structures. And now these are nuclei. So this here is a nucleus. When we look at muscle cell structure, it's a bit different than the usual kind of animal cell that we talk about. So you can see we've got these nuclei. We've got one here, we've got one there, distributed quite randomly across this myofibril. You might be able to see there's mitochondria just here. I'll label that one in red there. I'll put that in. Site of aerobic respiration. So we've got some mitochondria in there. This label to the right, this, if you like, is our cell membrane, but we call it something special when we look at muscle. So this is our cell membrane, if you like, but it has a special name when we think about muscle, and it's called the sarcomere. So that's the proper name that we give this outer covering of the myofibril, the sarcomere. Now you might be able to see that along this myofibril we have, if I just do in black here, we've got a sort of dark band here, and then either side of that black line that I've just drawn, you should see that it's sort of lighter coloured. So along the way of the myofibril you can see sort of dark bands. So we've got one here as well, just one there. So you've got a series of dark bands and associated light bands. Now, those structures are what we call sarcomeres. And I'm going to just zoom in, if you like, on that particular bit to talk about the structure of a sarcomere. So I'll do this at the top. In fact, what I might do is just shrink the screen ever so slightly. Just create a little bit more room so we can talk about what's called the sarcomere. So if I now draw in another arrow and we look at those bandings, then what you see is something a bit like this. So you have, and I'll colour them in red, you have really thick filaments making up the muscle, and these thick filaments are called myosin. So they're myosin filaments. Then you have what are called actin filaments, much thinner ones, running a bit like this. So we have thick myosin filaments, and then you have much thinner, what are called actin filaments. And this whole region here is what we know as a sarcomere. So we've zoomed in on our initial muscle, we've looked at a muscle fascicle, we've gone deeper into the muscle fascicle to look at a muscle fibre or a myofibril. And now we're talking about the inner structure, if you like, of that myofibril. It's made of actin and myosin filaments, thick, big myosin filaments with thinner actin filaments that appear to sort of be running between them. And they form collectively what we call a sarcomere. Now we have, and I'm going to colour this in green just to make a slight distinction, we give each region, if you like, of the sarcomere a different letter or assign a different name to it so people know what we're referring to. These two dashed black lines that I've drawn are what we call Z lines. So they are Z lines. So we say the sarcomere runs between those Z lines. And we have a line in the middle, and that's our M line. So M in the middle and our Z lines either side. Then we have what's called a dark band. So to properly show this, I'll just shrink the screen and lift it a little higher here. So let's think about this dark band, and this bit will colour in, I'll label it in pink. The dark band runs from this point here to this point here. So this whole region is what we call the dark band. Then we have these regions to the side, and they are what we refer to as our light bands. So you have a central dark band and light bands to the side. And there's one area, if you like, just, and I think I'll use the red, or we go for black just to highlight this central region here. If I just draw a line down from here to here, so this region within the dark band, around that sort of M line, if you like, that central region is called the H zone. You might be able to see that that H zone encompasses the thick parts of the myosin filaments. So I'll shade it in red so it's even clearer to see. So these thick parts here, but it doesn't extend to, if you like, touching any of the blue actin filaments. You can see that these blue actin filaments end pretty much where the H zone ends, like there. So the H zone is a very particular part of this sarcomere. Now I'm sure you can imagine that if we were to do a cross-section in real life of this sarcomere, we'd see very different things depending on where we were to look at. So a cross-section just within that light band, we'd only be able to see actin filaments. If you were to do a cross-section in the H zone, you'd only see the myosin filaments. And if you were to do a cross-section at the end of the dark band, for example, you could see, so I'm talking about this sort of region, say there. If you were to do a cross-section in the dark band there, then you could see that you'd be able to see in cross-section the myosin and the actin filaments together. Now I want to finish this video by talking about actin and myosin specifically, because their structure relates to muscle contraction. So this is almost like an ending to this video and an opening, if you like, to the second one on contraction that I'm going to do. If we look at myosin, so let's take myosin first, the myosin filament, then what you see, so I'll just draw, and I'm just drawing this very, very roughly. Let's put our myosin filament in. Then what you have at the end of the myosin filament is actually something called the myosin head. Sort of an enlarged portion of this filament. So that bit there is what we call the myosin head. And that's all I'm going to say at this point on that. If we were to look at the actin filament a little bit closer, so let's put in our actin filament here, it's much thinner. Then we see something quite special around that filament. So if you were to look at that filament more specifically, what you see is something a bit like this. You have a strand, if you like, of something called tropomyosin wound around that actin filament. That's what I've just drawn in purple here. So you have this tropomyosin wound around this actin filament, and on that tropomyosin are regions like this, and those regions are made up of what we call troponin. So I'll put that up here. So we have troponin. So when it comes to actin, we actually have tropomyosin filament wrapped around it with troponin, or a troponin complex, at various points along that tropomyosin. Now the reason why we have that is because actually when we want to contract the muscle, calcium will actually bind to the troponin complex, and that will change the shape, if you like, of the tropomyosin, and the tropomyosin almost not unravels but slightly unwinds off that actin filament, and it exposes particular binding sites. And it's those binding sites that we're going to need to get the muscle to contract. But like I said, I'll talk about that in a separate video. This is just to really highlight the existence of the tropomyosin around the actin filament and those troponin complexes on that tropomyosin, and the fact that myosin has a myosin head attached to it. Okay, so that's a little bit there about the structure of skeletal muscle. Hope that helps.